Welcome to the Western Bell podcast series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of the series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only, and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled Fun with Self-Hatred. The talk was given by Bandhu Dunham on October 25th, 2025 via Zoom. Bandhu is the author of Creative Life and an internationally recognized glass artist and teacher. In this presentation, he speaks about forms of behavior that can be rooted in self-hatred and about the futility of trying to paste self-love on top of self-hate. He discusses origins of self-hatred, the impact of addictive behavior, the drama triangle, and the flip side of self-hate. Bandhu talks about principles of Buddhist psychology, ways of working with self-hatred, and the need for tension on the path of transformation. In the conversation with spiritual practitioners and glass artists in attendance, he uses material from the School of Life and from nextculture.org. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Bandhu Dunham.
So let's start with a brief little meditation here. I'd like you to close your eyes unless you're driving or blowing glass or something, and take a moment to remember an important opportunity that you missed. The more important, the better. Just remember that, what it meant to you. Okay, that's it. So you might investigate yourself a little bit. You could put it on an imaginary scale of 1 to 10. We're not going to grade anybody or anything. But to what degree that memory elicits self-reproach, maybe even self-hatred, or whether it's just opportunity missed, there'll be others. So you might figure where you place on that scale. And of course, we place different for different events. But basically, I think a lot of us, remembering an opportunity that I missed, there's definitely an element of self-hatred there. Like, how could I be so stupid? You idiot. Things like that. Why didn't I see what was going on? So I want to start by defining terms a little bit, and we have an experiential definition to whatever degree it applies. And I'm going to define self-hatred, and there's probably a more rigorous psychological definition, but this will suit our purposes. Self-hatred is the critical voices in your head that go beyond constructive evaluation and critique. So it's one thing to realize you made a mistake, you did something wrong, to regret that. It's another thing to start berating yourself for it, start giving yourself a hard time. A lot of critical judgments involved. So my talk is to some degree structured. I have some sections of it structured, but it's also a little bit random in some respects. So we'll see how much I actually get to. There's a lot that can be said about self-hatred, as you may be able to imagine. Let's start with a few observations about self-hatred. It operates both visibly and invisibly. Sometimes we don't realize that we're operating off of self-hatred. It's motivating us from within, causing behaviors that we don't realize are tied in with self-hatred. So it underlies a lot of things. And sometimes it's much more visible. Just like in the example I was discussing of saying, how could I be so stupid? It's transmitted or installed between generations. Like many forms of abuse, it can be passed from one generation to another, even without people knowing that they're doing that, passing these things on to their kids. Self-hatred is and isn't a choice. There's a saying that when you react to something, you're not really responsible for your first thought because our reactions are too quick. You're not responsible for your first thought in reaction to a situation, but you are responsible for your second thought. So a degree of mindfulness is called for if we want to work with these things, of seeing what your second thought might be that could be something you can control. And hopefully some of what we discussed tonight is going to be useful for that. Self-hatred is kind of self-contained and self-validating. It doesn't respond to reason. It's enclosed in a self-validating sort of bubble. Because we're coming from self-hatred, anything that attempts to divert or change that self-hatred often just makes things worse. This is pointed out in the very excellent book on self-hatred that's put out by the School of Life. I just always like to plug the School of Life. I think they're really great. They didn't pay me to do that. I'm a paying member. They're not sponsoring me or anything, but they have really good, both printed and online resources for all kinds of interesting psychological and borderline spiritual topics. So they have a book called On Self-Hatred. But one of the things they point out, and other people obviously have pointed it out, that sometimes people think if you're dealing with self-hatred, what you really need is to love yourself more. And that sounds like a good thing. But really, when you try putting self-love on top of self-hatred, it doesn't often work that well. I've been struggling to love myself more. I put affirmations on my bathroom mirror. I listen to tapes. I've got posters in my office that say to love myself and give yourself a break and all these things. And if it's not working, then what that means is I am also a failure at being able to love myself. I am even more pathetic than I thought I was, right? So that's a very typical counterintuitive response when we try to pile self-love on top of self-hate. So don't try that. It really doesn't work. It's not the right approach. And we'll get into things that are more useful as we go along here. So fun with self-hatred, that's our topic for tonight. I just wanted to point out that everything is more fun against a background of self-hatred. Everything is just more entertaining and more dynamic. There's this spiritual or metaphysical idea that the universe exists for God's entertainment. God created the universe in order to witness himself or itself. That's part of the Krishna Lila that they talk about in Hinduism. And what better drama and entertainment could there be than self-hatred? So anyway, we'll get into some of that as we go along. So the School of Life that I mentioned in their book on self-hatred, their chapter titles kind of lay out several categories of self-hatred. A pretty comprehensive list, but maybe they left something out. So forms of self-hatred, high achievement. Very often people who are high achievers are actually motivated by a hidden self-hatred that they themselves are not acknowledging. Romantic masochism. That's a good one. That's when people keep getting in relationship with the wrong person. How are they so unlucky in love? Is it a coincidence or is it a conspiracy? Actually, it's a conspiracy. The unlucky lovers are curating the possible partners in their environment and brushing off people who are perfectly decent and might actually be kind to them because they can't stand to be with someone who's kind to them. And of course, this is unconscious, but they're gravitating towards people who are going to treat them the way they feel they deserve, which is badly. So that's romantic masochism. Shyness. Chronically shy people are often dealing with self-hatred as an unknown motivator. Imposter syndrome. That's a good one. At social media, everybody has to deal with imposter syndrome. Say on your social media accounts, you follow people. And say life on average provides people with an extraordinary, wonderful, joyful event once every 10 days. 1 out of 10 of them on any given day is having something really wonderful happen, and they're posting it. That means on your feed, you are seeing in any given day 100 people having great, wonderful things happen in their life. Out of 1,000, we're thinking all the people that I see on my feed are having a great time except me. So social media really tends to feed self-hatred because we don't think about the fact that the view we're seeing of other people's lives is highly curated. We see our own life from the inside, but we only see other people's life from the outside. So we may not notice that those other people who are having these wonderful days, the other 9 days out of 10 are just as miserable as us. They may not be sharing that with us on their stream. You get the point. Social media is really pretty deadly. People pleasing, that's another one of the manifestations of self-hatred that the School of Life talks about. So people who are chronically pleasing, trying to please others, they need to please others. When you first meet them, you think, hey, this person's really great. They agree with everything I say. Anything I suggest, they think is a great idea. Wow. But as you get to know them after a while, they become less and less pleasing. So people pleasing is one of those. Anxiety, just persistent anxiety, can be caused by self-hatred. Kind of gnawing anxiety, it's just always with you. Perfectionism, of course, that should be pretty obvious. Perfectionism is a manifestation of self-hatred. Having perfectionistic parents, for example, might cause you to hate yourself. And so this creates a cycle. Grandiosity, that's a really good one. People tend not to associate grandiosity with self-hatred, but really, grandiosity is a classic manifestation of self-hatred. If we look at our political and social scene these days, a lot of these people who are manifesting in grandiose ways, they're riddled with self-hatred. They can't afford to face it, however rich they might be, but self-hatred is the motivating force behind a lot of grandiosity. Furthermore, the School of Life points out that the origins of self-hatred are several, and they list a few. One is emotional neglect as a child. As children, we are completely dependent on our caretakers. We don't have the option to have opinions about them, to yell at them, to get mad at them, to go somewhere else. As young children, there's just no other reality besides being cared for by our caretakers. So everything in our experience has to fit into that box. And if there's something wrong, like we're being ignored or being treated badly in some way, we can't afford, as young children, to think there's something wrong with my caretakers. They are neglecting me because something is missing in them, or they're failing to do their job. That's sort of a dangerous thought we can't let enter our mind. In fact, we really will actively try to block that out. And one of the things that children will do is to then say, well, if there's something wrong here and it can't be mom and dad or who's ever taking care of me, there must be something wrong with me. So that conclusion is another foundation of self-hatred. Other forms of poor parenting can also create self-hatred. Obviously, physical and emotional abuse of different kinds are really detrimental. And also, there's this cycle of addiction. If you're familiar with how addiction works, whether it's addiction to drugs or TV or sex or the internet or whatever, we're involved with our addictive behavior. It gets out of control. We crash. It's terrible. We have regret. And then we vow to be different. We resolve to conquer our addiction. We abstain. We're strong for a while. And then at some point, that just collapses and crashes. And that cycle also fits very well into restoring and regenerating in a cyclical, wonderful way, self-hatred. Isn't that entertaining? Let's talk about the entertainment value of self-hatred a little bit more. As I said, maybe the universe is created by God in order for God to see God's self, to be entertained by the wonderful manifestations like I have in my background picture here, all those saguaro cactuses, the lovely mountains. That's down in Tucson, actually. It's not where I am, but it's a nice picture. So the whole ecstatic, wonderful manifestation of the universe is for God's entertainment. And that includes all of our negative manifestations, all the things that we think are negative. So the evolutionary process that the universe is and goes through creates substances of a subtle nature, kind of like they talk about it in the Gurdjieff work, where subtle substances are being created by the evolutionary process, including our own personal evolutionary process. There are subtle forms of energy, subtle forms of food, subtle substances that become part of an alchemical mix. So if you're sensitive in a certain way, which I'm generally not, you can sometimes see that we are living in a vast circulating alchemical soup that generates new and interesting alchemical manifestations. And things move to higher levels of consciousness through this process. So we're swimming in that, just like nature creates diamonds. You know, we think about how nature creates diamonds from coal. Well, the coal was created from plants, right? Ancient prehistoric plants. So the universe is turning plants into diamonds. I mean, what the hell? It's a very amazing process. And it's an interesting drama. The whole thing's an interesting drama. Keeps God entertained. It's called the Leela, the play of life. It's an interesting drama. And of course, it includes all the negative stuff. Speaking of drama, if you're in touch with self-hatred in yourself, you might have noticed that very often it has a performative quality. By that, I mean it's a performance. It's something we're doing as a demonstration of loyalty to the people who used to abuse us. If mom and dad said I was a fuck up, then by God, I'm going to keep mom and dad happy by being a fuck up. That's pretty entertaining. And it's a performance. So it's a performative loyalty element for the benefit of remembered abusive caregivers. That's what I put in my notes. Now, here's another one. Have you ever heard of the drama triangle? The drama triangle, it's a psychological phenomenon that we encounter very often in life. You don't have to be especially neurotic to have it show up in your life, where we find ourselves seemingly by random coincidence, but in fact, by unconscious agreement with other people in a triangle. And the triangle has three roles. There is a victim, an abuser, and there's a rescuer. Those three roles are essential to the drama triangle, and they keep it going. It's a little bit self-explanatory. If I'm the victim, I'm the one who's feeling abused. My boss at work is treating me badly. My boss is the abuser, and he may very much enjoy that role. Some people put themselves in the role of being an employer specifically, unconsciously, so that they can abuse people because that gives them a certain satisfaction. You can show me by raise of hands. Has anyone ever worked by someone who seems to be doing that? They seem to be in their position specifically because they like being able to abuse their underlings. It doesn't take much imagination to imagine that, and some of us have experienced it as well. So we have the victim and we have the abuser, and then we have the rescuer. The rescuer role might be in that situation I just described. It might be the colleague who comes up to you and tries to reassure you that things are okay or commiserates with you, when the boss is not around, about how horrible that guy is and talking about them and keeping the drama going by that conversation. And you can probably come up with examples in your own life of that kind of thing. So the thing about the drama triangle is, as far as self-hatred is concerned, self-hatred is really wonderful because it's very efficient. With self-hatred, you can have all three roles in one person. You have the abuser, you have the victim, and you have the rescuer who might be trying to get out of this dynamic of self-hatred by applying, for example, I need to love myself, trying to apply self-love on top of the self-hatred. So what a great system. It's amazing that we can have all three roles of the drama triangle in a single person. I'm very impressed with the dynamic and creative nature of human consciousness. Okay, pleasures of self-hatred. It's so dramatic that it feels like it must be true. We are, as creatures, especially as human creatures, we have a certain destiny to be creative, create something. Everyone's path is different. Can't say what any particular person's path is. But it's our destiny to create something or pursue some passion that will not only contribute to the world, but contribute to our growth. In fact, that's why we're here. We're supposed to be doing that. But it's very easy to get sidetracked from that by all the influences in society. That's not news to anybody. The thing with self-hatred is, with all the drama it creates, it can make us think that we are engaged in this very important quest that we are on earth for, just by battling with our own self-hatred. It occupies so much energy that it seems to be the point of the whole thing. You may have met people who are wallowing in self-hatred or some other psychological dynamic to the point that it consumes their attention and excludes other possibilities. Like there's no possibility for them to get out of whatever loop they're in psychologically. In Buddhist psychology, they say that our perception of reality is something that we spin into existence. In its most natural state, consciousness has a stillness, but that we get bored with that. And so we create the reality that we perceive, not only in the outside world, but internally, by spinning this concept. It spins. Have you ever made a loop or a circle out of wire and spun it really fast? And it seems like something solid. You think you're looking at a sphere, but really what it is, it's only this one-dimensional thing, but it's spinning so fast, it seems to have reality. Well, that's the nature of our mind too. We think things are real that are only real because we've invested them with so much energy and they're spinning around so fast that they seem to be a solid object. How do we get to see that? Well, the Buddhists would say meditation. The practice of deep meditation is one of the ways that we can pierce the illusion of how the mind spins reality and come to a place where, in fact, we might get bored. The Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and I'm sure many others, highly recommends the state of boredom. Boredom is something, especially in our culture, we try to avoid as if it were the devil itself. And people make lots of money by helping each other avoid boredom. But boredom is worthy of exploring. Let's just say that. Maybe boredom would be a subject for a whole talk. Just sit in silence like John Cage giving a talk on boredom. So pleasures of self-hatred. One is that it spins this reality that seems very real. We have our emotional investment in it. It consumes our passion, makes us feel we're doing something important. Yes, I must hate myself. That's the only way to create justice in the universe and make mommy and daddy happy. Another pleasure of self-hatred is being right. I may be a fuck up, but at least when I abuse myself, I'm right. I have the pleasure of being right about it, something. I can't do anything right, so there's some satisfaction. Another pleasure of self-hatred is being virtuous in spite of oneself, literally, spite of oneself. Like I said, you can be right, even though everything you do is wrong. You feel that you're just hopeless. But if you hate yourself, you're sort of paying homage to what a good person you could be if only you weren't such a fuck up. Well, I am. So end of story. Good. Now I don't have to actually take responsibility for trying to make myself a better person or make better decisions or have more awareness of my unconscious manifestations. I can end the story with the punchline. Literally, the punchline is to hate myself.
You were talking about getting caught in the loop that we spin to create, if I understood it right, a sense of self. Like consciousness just is very still. And then we just spin this idea of who we are from that.
We get some input for that. As an infant, we are taught things from the moment we open our eyes, the input that we're being given by our surroundings and our caregivers.
Yeah, but this idea of the self, a small self, one separate self as a person, in the tradition they talk about that as being illusion. That's not who we are in truth.
Right.
So I'm just thinking about this idea of self-hatred. If you're caught up in that, if anybody is caught up in that, your whole life could be about trying to get out of that cycle. I mean, that could be the reason for one's existence, is to feel better about oneself. But it seems like that in itself doesn't solve the question of who one really is beyond all that. I guess what I'm saying is that being okay with oneself seems like it's a place to start. It's like where you start the spiritual path. How do you get there?
It's certainly essential on the path. These things, we talk about them in sort of linear ways, in sort of absolute terms, but there are breaks. Sometimes the universe, and there's such a thing as grace, perhaps, where God will come in and just throw something in front of us to break our pattern. All the stories of the journey of teachers, people who become teachers, who become enlightened or whatever, typically there's something that intrudes on their reality. Similarly, even if you're still caught up in self-hatred, there can be things that break through. The smile of a child or your pet jumping on your lap, it can just create enough of a break where the actual truth of reality can slip through there. Sometimes the experience of love does that for people. If you're not too involved in neurotic manifestations of love, but the experience of love can break that mold, the rigidity of the mold we're living in. So I'm describing things in sort of linear, rational terms, these principles, but there's always these gaps, and thank God, That's how we get loose from these things. Something impinges on our reality. It comes in through a chink in the armor. And that's our only hope. Otherwise, we might be just completely left on our own. But I think the universe wants us to evolve. It's always going to throw a monkey wrench into the works of our neatly packaged reality. But the point of it doing that is for us to then wake up enough to then take some responsibility and do the rest of the work ourselves, or much of the rest of the work ourselves. All right, let's talk about some symptoms. We already discussed some symptoms of self-hatred, but we'll look at it maybe from a little bit of a different angle, or some of these things in detail. Really, we could take that list that I was referring to earlier from the School of Life, and each one of those could be a talk in and of itself. I really highly recommend their book on self-hatred. You can get it as an audiobook. It's really great. So subconscious self-hatred shows up in conscious life. Recognizing it at work is one of the keys to being able to move beyond self-hatred. So learning to recognize it, learning to recognize when we do things that are based in self-hatred. Like self-hatred is often underlying an addiction that we might have to stress. So if you look at your life and you come to the conclusion that you are addicted to stress, which is not at all unusual, you might look a little deeper and see that that addiction to stress is actually founded on some form of self-hatred. And stress literally can be an addiction. So if we do anything to relieve the stress, we suddenly find ourselves doing something else to increase the stress again. And it can be something that seems innocuous, but it's an activity designed to create stress because we're addicted to a certain level of stress. Procrastination can just be an example of that. Doing things in a timely fashion, like if you're running a business, doing the things that come up that you have to do in an orderly fashion to complete a project or make products that you're selling or whatever, can be kind of boring. It's very logical, it's methodical, it's disciplined, and sometimes boring. But if you wait and let things pile up until suddenly you've got a whole bunch of stuff and a short deadline, it's very dramatic. And that drama itself, the level of stress it creates, the excitement of the drama, the excuse it gives you for yelling at your wife and kids, all of that feeds into the dynamic of what's psychologically comfortable, even though it's stressful. So self-sabotage is a good one. As a glass artist, I will occasionally injure myself, either a cut or a burn. It really goes with the territory, some degree of that happening. But every now and then it'll happen, like you have a hot piece of glass, you put it down, and then you pick the same thing up again immediately. It's like, how did I do that? How could I be so stupid? I just heated that piece of glass. It was just red hot. I put it down and then I pick it up again right on that hot spot. So that's a small but not inconsequential example, depending on how big it is. And there's manifestations of that kind of self-injury, either physical or emotional, that we can probably all relate to. So we're talking about being bored and lack of drama. And Chris Rock had this thing in one of his gigs. He said, you have a choice. You have a choice in life. I can't do his voice really, but you have a choice in life. You can be either single and lonely or married and bored. And he said that being single, it can be very dramatic. He says, getting crabs, that's exciting. So it's the kind of thing that can happen to you in the dating scene that makes it much more interesting and exciting than some kind of stable, nice relationship, whether married or just committed. So that's another reflection on the nature of our existence. It seems like it's the nature of our existence. It seems like that's just how the world is. But a lot of things that we think are just how the world is are actually things that we're creating unconsciously. Carl Jung said that until we bring into our conscious mind what is contained in our unconscious, the unconscious will continue to rule our lives, and we will label it as fate. You know, what was the expression they used here? The romantic masochist who keeps ending up with these terrible partners. They think it's just their fate. I'm unlucky in love. when in fact they're actually unconsciously curating the people they choose to go out with while not knowing it. That's a sad example, but one that's not completely unknown. I'm going to read a little thing. This friend of mine, Clint Callahan, has an organization called nextculture.org. And he and his team of people, it's an extensive international organization. They've taken a lot of spiritual and psychological teachings and framed them in their own unique framework with their own unique language that's very interesting. This is when they're talking about self-doubt. So they're framing it a little differently. They're saying that self-hatred is a manifestation of self-doubt. So they're calling this bigger umbrella self-doubt. But I'm just going to read the text of this. It's a couple paragraphs. Self-doubt is future fear. Each time you have an impulse to say or do something, you attach the story. If I try something, it could go wrong or it could fail, and I will be punished like I was before. This story triggers preemptive rage at yourself for even thinking about trying such a thing again. But the rage is actually towards the system or people who embarrassed or punished you. You twist your rage around to kill your impulses, killing the possibility of being hurt again. If you discover this self-doubt technology as a child, you may integrate it as a part of your survival strategy, destroying yourself before you make an error. You survive by not living. It is not stupid to think that what you say or do could go wrong, because anything you try could fail. You are not perfect. You are an experimenter. It is also not stupid to think that what you say or do could cause other people to react negatively, because they could react negatively. Other people are not perfect either, but that is their problem. The symptoms of self-doubt include hesitation, self-hatred, self-cannibalism, self-abuse, self-pressure, ongoing terror of error, withdrawal, panic attacks, lack of joyfulness or playfulness, lack of freedom of movement in all 5 bodies, silence when invited to speak, listlessness, lack of relating with other human beings or with life itself, lack of creativity, internal tensions in muscles and organs from fighting against their own aliveness, potentially leading to autoimmune diseases in the physical body. In the physical body, an autoimmune disease triggers the physical body's immune system to mistakenly attack and damage its own healthy cells and tissues instead of protecting them from harmful invaders like viruses or bacteria. In the emotional body, self-doubt is an autoimmune disease caused by a meme that triggers your emotional body's immune system, its fear and anger, to mistakenly attack and damage its own healthy impulses and desires instead of providing intelligence and energy for life on the transformational path. The meme is a piece of thoughtware saying, it is better to stop myself from trying than to be punished for making a mistake. The question at hand is, what are you going to do about it? So that's from nextculture.org. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. That's a great list they gave of all the symptoms of self-doubt. Do any of those not apply to anyone in the room? In their newsletter, some of these specific terms, like when they talk about the 5 bodies or self-cannibalism, those are hypertext. So you click on the thing and it takes you to a link on their website, which tells you more about those specific things. So more things about self-hatred. Let's talk about the upside of self-hatred. It is said, maybe it was Jung or someone else, that every neurotic manifestation has a flip side that is positive. So there are 2 sides of the same coin. So I'd like to consider whether it might be that self-hatred is the flip side of some positive manifestation, something that might be to our benefit. So what might this be for self-hatred? Any ideas?
Having had some experience with seeing this in myself and confronting it, for example, the drama triangle you were talking about, and noticing how I had a propensity to go to being a victim. What I began to do was, when I would see that in myself, was just to stop being a victim, which then diminishes the other 2 actors in that triangle. Of course, the actors are myself, but Mostly I was taking a victim position. I would say that was a very big part of my work on self for a very long time. And then when it comes up, I might see a nuance of it or a certain aspect of it, like you use the example of self-sabotage. And then I would see self-sabotage, it would like come out and grab me when I wasn't aware of what was going on. And all of a sudden that victim would be back again. But to be able to see it was the beginning of being able to diminish it by actually watching it and noticing it. So it wasn't about changing anything. It was about watching what I was up to, watching what the triggers were. It would come back to my practice of self-observation, basically.
Yeah.
And sometimes self-observation will reveal things that are not very pleasant. So I would say that an upside of self-hatred is that you get to see that with yourself. And if you're willing to accept that in yourself, then you have something that will be of some use to you. It's not about changing it, but it's about seeing it and feeling it and choosing something different when that's possible, like to not be a victim. This is how I'm feeling right now, but is that really what's going on?
Yeah, self-hatred, being dramatic in its manifestations, can be sort of a doorway into self-observation of other things that are subtler, that are going on in us. So that's definitely an upside. It can start us on a path of seeing deeper things as well.
Yeah, I would like to explore the word subtler because I think that gets misinterpreted sometimes.
It's less obvious in this case.
Less obvious or more unconscious. And I hear you saying that what we want to be doing is to be bringing up, as Jung said, what's running the show because we're not aware of it. It just takes a lot of practice to allow what's been unconscious to reveal itself and to not mess with it, basically, but to see it accurately. And that takes a lot of work. That's my experience.
Yeah. The sort of relaxation about things that we see about ourselves, whether it's self-hatred or something else, can be kind of boring. It locks that element of drama that we tend to be addicted to entertain ourselves with. So we have to be willing to be bored in this process, I think.
Bandhu, did you see a comment in the chat?
The flip side of self-hatred is self-love. Well, I don't like to use that term self-love for reasons that we stated earlier. In the school of life, what they say is the antidote to self-hatred is self-acceptance, which might seem like a subtle difference, but it's an important one. Because you don't want to just be trying to pile self-love on top of self-hatred. What you want is self-acceptance, which is a kind of realism. Same way that perfectionism is a form of self-hatred, realism can be a form of self-acceptance that helps us to deal with or diffuse some of the energy behind self-hatred.
What I've heard and what I think is true is that self-hatred and self-doubt is a lack of self-esteem, and that we have self-esteem if we do the right thing and not the easy thing. I'm wondering, are you suggesting or not that the self-hatred that we commonly feel like is because we are looking for some kind of cues outside of ourselves, whereas if we can feel inside of ourselves and do the right thing and not the easy thing, that could be a bridge forward?
Yeah, I think that definitely has a part to play. But we also have to be careful about that tricky thing of trying to pile something positive on top of the negative foundation. So self-esteem is sometimes discussed as if it were something you could paste over your self-hatred with, like a Band-Aid or a remedy.
Right.
So self-esteem does come from doing the right thing. Like, I think self-esteem has to begin with self-acceptance. So anything that interferes with self-acceptance is not going to be a remedy for self-hatred. There has to be self-acceptance first, and then self-hatred can begin to unravel. And then self-esteem definitely has a part to play in that. The fact that you do the right thing or you have the right motivations anyway, when you really accept yourself, then that can be empowering, self-empowering. But if the self-hatred is still intact underneath it, I think it's going to be a Sisyphean struggle because it'll keep breaking down. The self-hatred will find a way to leak through. Or again, like I was mentioning earlier, then any failure to be successful in cultivating self-esteem then becomes further evidence for why you're hate-worthy, contemptible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get what you're saying, but okay, so what's the bridge then? Is it being bored long enough so that you can feel the pain that's hiding behind your self-hatred?
Yeah, you have to be willing to see it. It may or may not involve boredom, but you have to be willing to be bored. You have to be willing to give up the drama that creates this sort of cloud of squid ink that obscures seeing what really needs to be seen. It kind of boils down to self-observation. But whatever it takes for us to get to a place of self-acceptance, I think is going to serve our battle with self-hatred. And anything that does not address self-hatred at its base is going to tend to be just a Band-Aid on top of it that won't really have a long-term successful result. That's how it seems to me, anyway.
Okay. It feels to me, and of course, it's my filters at play here, that this is an intellectual discussion about something that's not intellectual. Or is it? Is all the self-talk, is it just the mind? Does the heart play part?
Oh, yeah. Well, it can be just an intellectual discussion. And here we are on Zoom, just exchanging words, right? But the kind of self-observation I'm talking about is not just a clinical mental analysis. It involves feeling what's going on in your body, and it definitely involves the heart. When I say you have to be willing to see what's going on, it's not just seeing it, it's actually feeling it as well. So if you had neglectful parents who ignored you, and that led you to the conclusion that you weren't worth much, you not only have to understand the psychological dynamic of that, you have to be willing to feel the pain of that. I'm not a therapist. I'm not going to pretend to be qualified to lead someone in that process. There's a lot of it we can do ourselves through self-observation. But in many cases, we also need the guidance of someone who can keep us from kidding ourselves. Because if I'm observing something painful in myself and I go back and I encounter perhaps a traumatic experience, which for a child doesn't have to be extreme physical abuse. It can just be a comment that somebody made, or just the persistent feeling that you're undervalued. The mind wants to distract us. We really don't want to see that. I find personally, I don't want to see that. My mind is going to come up with something else, which is why meditation practice can be very useful, because in meditation practice, we learn to be present in spite of all the interesting things that the mind comes up with. We learn to just be present and see what's going on. And that skill set can be very valuable in seeing into our own psychology, and not only seeing it, but feeling it, because the feeling of it is definitely key to the process.
Well, the bridge, it seems to me, to self-acceptance is being with all the difficult feelings that come up and really knowing where they came from. You use the example at the outset. I mean, it could be anything, though, of someone who repeats getting into dysfunctional relationships or abusive relationships. And you can beat yourself up for that, or for any number of things, really, depending on your own patterns. But feeling the pain of that, or whatever it is, and also understanding that this came about because of things that happened to you at a very early age. Whatever that is, you had a dysfunctional male figure in your life and you're trying to get love from that person. And if you see that and you realize your patterns, I think self-compassion comes out of that. And I think it's possible, I mean, I've experienced this in my own case, I would say, to come to some degree of self-acceptance and self-love as a result, to really have compassion for oneself, for what one has been through, and to work with the patterns from a place of not needing to change it because you're a bad person.
Yeah.
And things just kind of change by themselves gradually over time. But the patterns, I don't think they go away entirely. They're part of you. But can you love even the broken and ruined parts of yourself, accepting how they came into being?
It's a great adventure to find out all the things we hate about ourselves and to accept them. It's like a quest. It's the hero's journey, literally.
It actually is.
Yes. It's what we're here for.
And then going on from there.
Yeah.
It's like, keep going. Like, what's next?
Yeah, it's one aspect of what we're here for. So when I was thinking about what might be an upside of self-hatred, humility came up in my mind. I mean, humility is often a neurotic manifestation of self-hatred, but the patterns of self-hatred can also teach us things about humility. If we were to get rid of the self-hatred, the benefits of humility might remain. And I put some notes here. In what ways might self-hatred be useful? Restraint. The thing from Next Culture was talking about how terrible it is that we're restrained by self-doubt and self-hatred. But a restraint is actually a virtue. In Japanese culture, they put a lot of attention on the value and virtue of restraint in your social actions. It just points out that our notion of freedom that we're operating under in America may be cultural, but restraint can help us prevent mistakes. Because of self-hatred, you might not take that great Bitcoin opportunity that someone just emailed you about. So restraint actually can have a value. It's not like we just need to throw off all restraints and then be free and then we'll be happy. That's a bunch of crap, actually. There was a Supreme Court Justice, Learned Hand, some years ago, and he had a speech, which was made into a pamphlet called The Spirit of Liberty, talking about American values and the value of liberty. One of the things he said was that the spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not quite sure it is right. And if you think about that, it makes a lot of sense. When you're so sure that you're right, that you have no doubts, that's when you start getting into situations when you're willing to use excessive force on people. That's when you feel that's perfectly fine to impose your will on other people because, damn it, I am right. And that's the opposite of the spirit of liberty. The spirit of liberty is like the scientific method. The scientific method always has built into it the possibility of whatever conclusion is generated being revised when further evidence comes up or when circumstances change. And the results of scientific studies get peer-reviewed before they're published, ideally. Some of that's been breaking down, but gets reviewed by peers who say, well, your statistical analysis of your data is wrong. Really, the thing that you're concluding is not what's going on. So the scientific method, always having that little bit of doubt, always investigating to see what's actually true, and then being willing to revise that as new evidence or other people's experiments bring in different aspects of that. So useful doubts. So self-doubt can be a useful thing under those circumstances.
Self-observation. If you approach it in the same way as you do a scientific method, you will evolve as you keep observing. At least that's what I can say about myself.
Whatever conclusions you come to, whatever opinions you have, it's wise to have that little bit of wiggle room in there that I may not have all the facts at hand, or circumstances might change. So it's just an important thing to build into a mature personality is the understanding that what we believe is true might not be right. Another upside of self-hatred might be manners. We develop manners because we're a little bit restrained. We're not just bowling people over because we're so sure we're right. There's a bit of dialogue that we have with other people in our environment, but also just civility. Restraint can be a basis of civility. So I wouldn't want people to actually be hating themselves, but there's something to be learned from the dynamics of self-hatred about humility and restraint that I think are useful qualities. Doing the right thing for the wrong reason might be an upside of self-hatred. I might be kind to someone because I'm trying to make up for being such an awful person, and therefore I do something kind to another person. Ultimately, you want to be doing the right thing for the right reason. But in the meantime, the world is probably better off if you do the right thing for the wrong reason rather than doing the wrong thing for the wrong reason. I don't know if you ever saw this movie, Volleyball. So Ben Stiller, he's the bad guy and he owns a gym and he's all buff. They got like a muscle suit for him. So he's like this buff guy. He's completely self-centered. And in one of his ads for his gym, he's saying, I used to be a weakling until I learned to hate myself enough to work out and make myself buff. It was only when I learned to hate myself enough that I was able to do this. It's like, okay, good luck with that. And you might get to make yourself a buff body out of self-hatred. And in the movie, he gets his comeuppance at the end. It's really pathetic. It's quite entertaining, the movie as a whole.
A lot of suffering.
A lot of suffering, but it's very entertaining. Suffering is so entertaining to God, if not to us. I think sometimes self-hatred might be a necessary step along the way, or coming to terms with self-hatred, because it does help us develop compassion for other people. And if you've never come to understand your own self-hatred, then you might not really be able to manifest compassion for other people in useful ways. When you've seen into yourself and you see what's going on, it makes it a lot easier to serve what someone else's needs are. Much easier than if you were in denial about it. If you're in denial about it, you could be doing the right thing for the wrong reason, like being a rescuer, talk about the drama triangle, and go work in a soup kitchen. Well, that's a fine thing to do. But if you're doing it for the wrong reason, you're still in denial in terms of your own growth. So that self-hatred might put you on a path of developing more compassion, because then working that soup kitchen, learning the stories of people's lives, seeing people face to face who are suffering, that starts to develop something like real compassion. And so it might be an intermediate step that's useful in some way, but I don't recommend getting stuck there. Carlos Castaneda said that the path of knowledge is so weird and crazy that no sane person would get on the path of knowledge, that a sober-headed man must be tricked into it. So it's in the same way that I was just talking about how self-hatred might actually lead you on a path that would develop something real, like compassion or some other quality.
Self-hatred is also a cultural thing. 2 stories about that. One is that the Dalai Lama couldn't comprehend self-hatred. Took some effort talking to him, explaining that this is something that's real in the West. So it apparently doesn't exist in some other cultures. And I had the experience of one time being around a group of men from a different culture, and it was weird. It felt different. I kind of puzzled about it. And what I came to afterwards, this isn't exactly not self-hatred, but this group of men did not have this kind of Western self-doubt. These men were like men, and there was no apology about it. They were in America, but they weren't from this culture. That has led me to think that it's a cultural component. Do you think that it's more prevalent in Japan, where you have this high suicide rate?
Not to paint everyone with too broad a brush, but an artist friend of mine who taught glassblowing workshops in Japan a number of times, he described a discussion he was having with his students and maybe even some exercises he was doing with them. And all of the students in the class, when they got to the point of really getting real about what the challenges were to their creativity, there was a tremendous amount of self-doubt, self-hatred, and, being nice and being polite can be a mask for self-hatred, which is not to say that I wouldn't love to live in Japan, maybe, but there are cultural proclivities in different ways.
Kind of to muddy the waters further, shame is very much a part of self-hatred. Shame is a component of that. That's a whole area to explore, actually, I guess.
Yeah. Shame definitely feeds into all this.
I'm thinking of self-hatred as really being rooted in just not feeling good enough, not feeling enough. You were mentioning social media, about how everything is so comparative, and what's valued is something that's really unattainable for a lot of people, fame and wealth and all this that one doesn't have, so one feels not good enough, and there's something wrong with one. That's part of it that doesn't exist in some indigenous cultures.
We've got a few minutes left. I'd like to get into some strategies for dealing with self-hatred, but a couple more things to talk about that might be the upside of self-hatred or restraint. Years ago, there was this guy in Berkeley. I don't know if he's still around. I had read about him in some underground press, and then I was in Berkeley and I actually ran into him. And he was known as Hate Man. He was Hate Man. He was a street character. I don't know if he literally lived on the street, if he had somewhere he went at night. But the thing he stood for was the fact, in his mind, that the only thing that is real is people's hatred for each other. We pretend to like each other. We pretend to be nice, but damn it, the only thing that counts for anything that is really going on is hate. That all comes down to hate. And he had a whole belief system based on hate. He was actually not a mean guy. He was just recognizing the way things were. That was his attitude. Like, this is really what's going on. And unless we acknowledge and accept what's really going on, we're just kidding ourselves. So it's all just hate. And I met him, just happened to see him on the street when I was walking around Berkeley. And I went up to him, knowing this little bit about his philosophy. And I said, "Are you Hate Man?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Dude, I hate you." And he stood up a little straighter and said, "I get you," with a satisfied smile on his face, because I was acknowledging the truth of hate. And the thing I got from that is, like, it's about having a realistic perspective. Self-hatred in some form, if we water it down a bit, there's something realistic about acknowledging our limitations. It's in some ways more desirable than having this unrealistic vision of how wonderful the world is and how human beings are just full of love and we can just love each other and everything will be great. You can imagine a guy living on the streets in Berkeley, maybe even he was around when the hippies were big, and love and everything, and just looking at all that and going, what is this shit? It's not about love. It's about hate, damn it. So I really appreciated him. I didn't get to know him well. I just had that one interaction. Another thing that occurred to me about self-hatred as an upside is there's this thing they talk about in the fourth way work, the Gurdjieff work, of the struggle between yes and no. To be alive, there is a certain tension we need to have in our being, in our consciousness, which is this struggle between yes and no. The basic idea is that when things are placid and we feel at peace, we're settled, then we're not engaged in the path of transformation, generally. I mean, obviously there are moments of that, but there generally needs to be a friction in our existence. So the struggle between yes and no, is it this way? Is it that way? There's some kind of paradox. I see both things. I see the yes, I see the no. This struggle, it creates a kind of heat, or what might be called tapas in yoga, transformational energy, if we tap into it the right way, that can be useful. So the struggle between yes and no, that struck me as having something to do with what might be useful about the struggle that self-hatred engenders. So again, I'm not really recommending self-hatred as a methodology, but I'm trying to point out ways in which there might be a flip side to it. It's of some benefit. And understanding that, we can maybe accept it a little bit more for what it is. And that acceptance is actually the thing that's useful in dealing with self-hatred. So I did want to talk about some solutions or strategies for dealing with self-hatred. Obviously, not hating oneself more is a good idea. So that drama triangle, when we see that drama triangle operating, taking a step back from it, getting some perspective, and we don't want to be trying to rescue ourselves, because rescue is part of the drama triangle. It's not about rescuing. It's about gaining perspective. One of the techniques of gaining perspective clearly is to have a sense of humor about it, right? Which we've had a little bit in this talk tonight. There's the cliche of the tortured comedian, that people grow up to be comedians because they grew up in an abusive household where they were performing in a way maybe to distract daddy so he wouldn't beat him or wouldn't beat mommy, creating jokes, being the clown, being the player. It's a kind of rescuer position. But the development of a sense of humor actually can be a way of dissipating the negative energy of self-hatred. In the School of Life, Another one of their really useful books is called On Confidence. And it's mostly about all the ways in which we are not confident. But one of the things they say is that, we're operating under an illusion that we can somehow get to a state or a stage in life where we are beyond mockery. Maybe by making yourself president of the United States, you will be in a position where no one will mock you. But you know what? There is no such thing as any position in life where you'll not be mocked, especially if you deserve it. So the thing we should do is not to try to be immune to mockery, but to realize that realistically, being an idiot is part of the human condition. We should actually acknowledge and accept that we have been idiots in the past, we are being idiots right now, and we are likely to be idiots again in the future. And that actually idiocy in human manifestation, the history of the human race, idiocy is far more common than we would like to admit. And if we accept that idiocy is just part of the picture, that we are idiots, that we have the possibility of becoming what could be referred to as a lovable idiot. Like if you watch comedy shows, there are often these anti-heroes. They do idiotic things. Cartman on South Park. The guy does such shit, but he's still a lovable character. And there are other characters in comedy who are idiots, but they're lovable idiots. And so the solution that is recommended by the School of Life, which I think I can probably endorse, is to recognize that we are lovable idiots, that our idiocy is just part of the human condition, not a thing to be ashamed of, a thing perhaps to be minimized by being careful. But even our best efforts often will lead to calamity because there's something we didn't know about, or circumstances change. There are things outside our control. Our best efforts may lead to folly. And that's a thing to accept with a degree of good humor. Our bodies are not perfect. When you look in the mirror, you are not seeing Brad Pitt or whatever movie star you might think you should look like. And if we practice self-acceptance, then we can just acknowledge that. What, are you really going to go through the surgery and everything it would take to look like Brad Pitt or whoever your model is of who you should look like? I mean, Brad Pitt himself is getting older now, right? No one can avoid the course of life, the nature of human existence. So self-forgiveness, self-acceptance, I think are essential to dealing with self-hatred. That's the basic idea.
I was thinking of that shame and that guilt. It's almost like, you want to just beat yourself up all the time. All I could think about is just doing the next right thing and let go of the past so you don't live in that self-hatred, because it will tear you up, or it tears me up. It just rolls and rolls in my head on how I should have been, and we all make mistakes, and not to beat ourselves up about it.
I was thinking that self-deprecating humor is really funny. People really like that. And that's telling, I think. Mm-hmm. There was this old comedian, Rodney Dangerfield, who would just say, "I don't get no respect." And then he'd say something
about being an idiot. Yeah.
Yeah, that showed that he was an idiot, and people would just find that hysterical. And like we would project that onto other people.
Thank you all for coming. I think this is a very rich topic, one that never grows old and connects to a lot of other things, like shame. We hardly talked about shame, but that's got a lot to do with it. So thank you all very much.